The hangar lights were too bright for 11 at night, the kind of white-blue glare that made every face look tired and every shadow look sharper than it should. Olivia Bennet stood at the base of the air stair, with her arms crossed over a coat she hadn't bothered to button, watching a man she had never met kneel beside the open access panel of her Gulfstream's left engine, a flashlight clenched in his teeth, his hands moving with a stillness that made everyone else in the hangar go quiet without meaning to. 20 minutes earlier, 3 senior engineers from the manufacturer had told her, apologetically, that the fault was intermittent and might take until morning to isolate. 20 minutes earlier, she had been ready to lose $400 million and a merger 3 years in the making because a sensor she couldn't see and didn't understand refused to behave. Now there was a stranger in a faded airport maintenance jacket, grease on his forearm, quietly turning a component a quarter turn with 2 fingers, and the whole cabin display flickered green. He didn't smile. He didn't look up right away. He just said, almost to himself, "There it is," the way a man might say it after finding a dropped key in the grass. Olivia Bennet felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with the merger at all. To find out who this man really was, and what her mother would whisper to her before the night was over, stay until the very end. 3 years before that night, none of this existed. Not the merger, not the hangar, not the quiet man with grease on his hands. Back then, Austin Brooks was simply the name on a maintenance schedule at a regional airport outside Denver, a name nobody outside of Hangar 4 had reason to know. He was 36 years old, a widower for the past 2 of them, and the father of an 8-year-old girl named Emma, who still slept with the reading light on, because the dark reminded her of the hospital. Austin worked the overnight shift on purpose. It paid a shift differential that meant Emma's after-school program was covered, and it meant he was home by 7 each morning to walk her to the bus stop himself, lunch packed, hair combed, the small rituals that had become, since Rachel died, the entire architecture of his life. He had been an aviation systems engineer once, the kind who signs off on airworthiness certifications with his name attached to the record permanently, and he had walked away from that career after an incident that never made the news but ended his name's usefulness in the industry all the same. He did not talk about it. Not to coworkers, not to the woman at his daughter's school who kept trying to set him up with her sister, not even to himself most days. He had learned that silence, applied consistently enough, becomes a kind of shelter. If these kinds of stories, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the people who carry more history than anyone around them realizes, speak to something in you, you're already exactly the audience this was written for. And there will be more to say about that once the story is finished. Olivia Bennet, in that same stretch of ordinary time 3 years back, was the newly installed CEO of Bennett Aerospace Holdings, a company her grandfather had founded, and her mother had quietly kept alive through 2 recessions, and which Olivia herself had spent a decade trying to prove she deserved to run. She was 39, unmarried, and had not taken a vacation longer than 4 days since she'd inherited the position. She ran her company the way she ran her body, on discipline, on numbers, on the conviction that feelings were simply data she hadn't processed yet. Her mother, Margaret Bennet, 71 years old and officially retired from the board, still kept an office 2 doors down from Olivia's, ostensibly for historical continuity. Though everyone, including Olivia, understood it was really so, Margaret could keep watching her daughter from a safe, loving distance. Margaret had buried a husband and outlived a company scare that nearly took the family name down with it, and what she had learned in all those years was how to recognize the difference between a person who is impressive and a person who is good. It was a distinction Olivia had not yet had cause to make, because the men in her professional orbit had for a decade competed only on the first metric. Chief among them was Derek Halloway, the company's longtime VP of Flight Operations, a man with a handshake so warm it made people forget to ask follow-up questions. Derek had built his career on being the person in the room who always had an answer, delivered smoothly, in language that sounded technical enough to end debate. He had also, 7 years earlier, been the man who signed off on a maintenance shortcut that Austin Brooks had flagged in writing as unsafe, a corner cut to hit a delivery deadline that Derek needed hit to secure his promotion. When the resulting mechanical failure grounded a fleet and triggered a federal review, Derek had quietly and efficiently arranged for the paper trail to point toward the engineer who'd actually tried to stop it. Austin had been offered a choice that wasn't really a choice. Sign a settlement admitting partial fault, take the payout, and disappear quietly with enough money to keep Emma's mother's medical bills from bankrupting them. Or fight it and lose everything while she was still alive to watch him lose it. He had signed. He had never regretted protecting his family, not once, but some nights the shape of that old injustice still sat on his chest like a stone he'd learned to sleep around. None of these three people, the tired single father, the driven young CEO, the smiling man who'd built a career on someone else's mistake, had any reason yet to think their lives would intersect. Bennett Aerospace was finalizing the largest merger in its history, a partnership with a Pacific Rim logistics conglomerate worth $412 million, contingent on a signing ceremony that required Olivia to fly out within the week aboard the company's flagship jet, the same aircraft that would, 6 days later, sit dead and unresponsive on a runway with the whole deal hanging on whether anyone alive could find out why. Derek Holloway had personally signed off on that jet's last maintenance cycle. He had also, without telling anyone, quietly transferred the actual hands-on inspection to a junior contractor to save 2 days on the schedule, the same kind of shortcut that had cost Austin Brooks his name once already. He did not think of it as dangerous. He thought of it as efficient. That was, historically, exactly the kind of thinking that had put Austin in a hangar with a flashlight in his teeth at 11 at night, staring at damage nobody else could explain, 3 years earlier than he ever should have had to. 8 months would pass in ordinary, uneventful rhythm. Emma's ballet recitals, Austin's night shifts, Olivia's steady climb toward the merger deadline, before a maintenance log entry, buried and unread, would begin the slow process of coming back to the surface. The 8 months that followed were unremarkable, in the way that most good, quiet years are unremarkable, which is to say Austin barely noticed them passing except in the small increments by which Emma grew. A missing front tooth, then two, a growth spurt that meant new shoes twice in one spring, a stubborn insistence on wearing her mother's old cardigan to school, even though it hung to her knees. He kept his head down at the airport. He was well liked by the other mechanics, respected by his shift supervisor, and entirely invisible to management, which was precisely how he had arranged things. He never mentioned his engineering background. When younger techs occasionally asked how he'd known to check some obscure fault line before it showed up on any diagnostic, he'd just shrug and say he'd seen something like it before, which was true, and left the reason unspoken, which was also in its way true. The trouble started the way trouble in large companies usually does, quietly, at the level of a decision nobody thought was important enough to escalate. Derek Holloway, under pressure to show cost savings ahead of a board review, had spent the better part of a year routing the flagship jet's maintenance work to a contractor firm that billed less and asked fewer questions. Corners were cut in ways that were individually defensible and collectively dangerous. Inspection intervals stretched. A component flagged as monitor instead of replace. Junior technicians' concerns about an intermittent electrical fault logged, and then quietly buried under a supervisor's sign-off that treated the issue as resolved. Austin had no visibility into any of this. He worked the general aviation side of the airport, not the corporate hangar where Bennett Aerospace kept its fleet, and the two worlds rarely touched. They touched on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, when a scheduling gap meant Austin was pulled to cover a shift in the VIP hangar for a technician who'd called in sick. It was there, doing nothing more dramatic than a routine walk-around on an aircraft that wasn't even the one that would later break down, that Austin noticed a maintenance record inconsistency, a component listed as inspected on a date when the aircraft's own flight logs showed it hadn't been on the ground. He mentioned it, carefully and in writing, to the hangar's shift lead, the way he'd been taught 2 years ago, back when he still believed that flagging a problem was the same thing as fixing it. The note reached Derek Holloway by the end of the week. Derek did not see a safety concern. He saw a nobody from general aviation questioning a paper trail he had personally signed off on, at the exact moment a merger-critical fleet review was underway, and he responded the only way his career had ever taught him to respond to inconvenient truths. He made the problem go away. He called Austin's supervisor personally, praised Austin's diligence in a tone that somehow managed to sound like a compliment and a warning at once, and suggested, with the kind of smooth authority that had always worked on people who hadn't been burned by him before, that perhaps Austin's talents were better suited to a role with less cross-departmental visibility. 2 weeks later, Austin's shift was quietly reassigned to the far end of the airport, nights only, no VIP hangar access, no explanation offered beyond restructuring. It wasn't a firing. It was smaller than that, and somehow worse, the kind of demotion designed to leave no trail and no recourse, delivered by a supervisor who clearly didn't understand why it was happening either, and wasn't given permission to say. Austin didn't fight it. He recognized the shape of it immediately, the smiling deniability, the vague language, the sense of a door closing softly enough that slamming it would have required a fight he no longer had the stomach for. He thought of Emma, asleep at home with the reading light still on, and he thought of the last time he'd fought a paper trail like this one, and what it had cost him. He signed the new schedule without comment. He drove home before dawn that night with the windows down despite the cold, and when he got in, he stood in Emma's doorway for a long moment just watching her breathe, and he did not tell her anything had changed, because as far as her life was concerned, nothing had. If you've ever been the one who noticed the problem and got quietly pushed aside for noticing it, the one who did the right thing and watched it cost you instead of helping you, you already know exactly what that Tuesday afternoon felt like for a man who'd lived it once before. 1 month later, an ordinary Thursday morning would place Austin Brooks back on the tarmac of the VIP hangar for the first time since his reassignment. Not by his own choice, but because the aircraft that mattered most to Bennett Aerospace would refuse, for reasons nobody could explain. To start, Olivia Bennett had not thought about Austin Brooks even once in the 8 months, since a maintenance note with his name on it had crossed her desk, stripped of context, filed under a folder Derek Holloway's assistant had labeled blandly, "Resolved Staffing." She had signed off on dozens of similar folders that season. It was Margaret, not Olivia, who first noticed something didn't sit right, and she noticed it the way she noticed most things now, sideways. In her retirement, with nothing left to prove, and therefore nothing left to distract her from paying attention, Margaret still reviewed the fleet safety summaries out of habit, a holdover from decades of running the operational side of the company, before Olivia took over the strategic side, and something about the language in that spring's staffing memo bothered her enough that she mentioned it, once, gently, over dinner. You had a technician flag a maintenance discrepancy on the flagship jet, and then he got reassigned within 2 weeks, Margaret said. Not as an accusation, just as an observation. The kind mothers make that daughters usually only understand the significance of much later. Olivia had waved it off at the time. She had a merger to close. She did not have room, she told herself, for hallway politics between departments she barely had time to visit. The crisis came, as these things usually do, at the worst possible moment. 6 days before the signing ceremony that would finalize the $412 million merger, the flagship Gulfstream, the same aircraft, coincidentally, whose maintenance record Austin had flagged 8 months earlier, refused to power up cleanly during a pre-flight check. An intermittent electrical fault, the very kind of issue that had been logged and quietly buried the previous spring, had finally metastasized into something the aircraft's own systems couldn't route around. 3 senior engineers from the manufacturer were flown in within 24 hours. They diagnosed a dozen possible causes and ruled out none of them conclusively. The fault would appear, vanish, reappear on a different subsystem entirely, the electrical equivalent of a ghost. Derek Holloway, increasingly desperate as the clock ran down, insisted repeatedly that the aircraft's maintenance history was immaculate, a word he used so many times in as many hours that Olivia began, for the first time, to actually hear it rather than simply accept it. It was Sandra Kim, a young operations analyst, who had quietly kept a spreadsheet of every unresolved maintenance flag across the fleet for her own peace of mind, who finally brought the 8-month-old note to Olivia directly, sliding a printed copy across the desk without a word of preamble. This technician flagged something that matches the fault pattern almost exactly, Sandra said. He was reassigned 2 weeks after he wrote it. I don't know if that's connected, But I thought you should see it before tomorrow. Olivia read the name at the bottom of the memo, Austin Brooks. And something about it needled at a memory she hadn't fully placed until her mother called for advice at 11 that night, said the name back to her slowly, like she was tasting it. Bring him in, Margaret said, simply. Whatever position he's in, whatever it takes. If he's the one who saw this coming 8 months before anyone else did, you don't have engineers right now. You have one engineer, and everyone else is guessing. Austin was located, reluctantly, working a night shift in a hangar 3/4 of a mile from the executive terminal, and brought over by a junior staffer who kept apologizing for the short notice as though it were somehow his fault. He arrived in his work jacket, grease still faintly visible on his knuckles, and said almost nothing as Olivia, exhausted and stripped for the first time in years of her usual composure, explained the situation and asked, directly, whether he could help. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't mention the demotion, or the note nobody had listened to, or the 8 months of nights spent in a colder, farther hangar than he'd once worked in. He simply asked to see the aircraft's full maintenance logs, all of them, going back 2 years. And when Derek Holloway tried to intervene, citing confidentiality protocols that had never once been enforced with any other engineer on the property, Olivia, for reasons she couldn't yet fully name, overruled him in front of the whole team. Derek Holloway's composure cracked, just slightly, at the edges, when Austin asked one specific question about a component replacement date that didn't match the flight logs. The exact discrepancy from 8 months earlier, still unresolved, still buried. Derek called it a clerical issue. Austin said nothing, only wrote the date down, and something in the quiet, exact way he did it made 2 of the manufacturer's own engineers exchange a look neither of them explained. It would be 3 more days before that particular exchange stopped being a look and became something undeniable. Whether Austin should have pushed harder the first time, 8 months earlier, instead of accepting a reassignment quietly the way he did, or whether staying silent then was the only way a father raising a daughter alone could afford to protect what mattered most to him is the kind of question this story doesn't answer easily, and it's worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly. 3 days later, at 11 o'clock at night, with the merger's future balanced on a component the size of a deck of cards, Austin Brooks would kneel beside an open access panel with a flashlight in his teeth, and the whole story would circle back, at last, to the exact scene it began with. The 10 minutes it took Austin to find the fault were the quietest 10 minutes Olivia Bennett had spent in years. She had grown used to problems that resolved through meetings, through leverage, through the particular kind of pressure that money and title could apply to almost any obstacle. This was different. This was a man working entirely by feel and memory, running his fingers along a wiring harness the manufacturer's own diagnostic software had cleared twice, until he stopped at a splice point no schematic had flagged as a likely failure site, and said quietly that the insulation had been chafing against a bracket edge for months, intermittently grounding out under vibration and correcting itself when the aircraft was stationary, which was exactly why nobody could catch it on the tarmac. He didn't dramatize the discovery. He simply reached for a roll of aviation-grade tape and a spare length of sleeving from his own kit, rerouted the harness a 1/4 inch clear of the bracket, and ran the startup sequence again. The cabin lit up green on the first try. He closed the panel, wiped his hands on a rag, and asked, without looking up, whether anyone wanted him to log the fix formally, because if they didn't put it in writing this time, it would happen again. That last sentence was the one that finally broke something open in Derek Holloway's careful composure. Sandra Kim, standing near the tail of the aircraft with the 8-month-old maintenance note still folded in her jacket pocket, quietly produced it and handed it to Olivia in front of the assembled engineers, the contractor supervisor, and Derek himself. The date on the note matched, almost to the week, the estimated onset of the chafing fault Austin had just repaired. Derek tried for a moment to reach for the same smooth language that had worked on every previous audience. A comment about how hindsight makes every flag look prophetic, a suggestion that this was simply an unlucky coincidence dressed up as vindication. But the words landed differently this time, in front of an aircraft that was now, undeniably, running correctly because of the exact thing he'd dismissed 8 months earlier. One of the manufacturer's own senior engineers, a man with no reason to protect Derek Holloway, said flatly that the original discrepancy note should have grounded the aircraft for a full harness inspection the day it was written, and that reassigning the person who wrote it, rather than investigating it, was a decision somebody was going to have to explain to the FAA, regardless of how the merger went. Margaret Bennett had watched the entire exchange from a folding chair near the hangar wall, wrapped in a coat too heavy for the season, saying nothing until the aircraft's engines had gone quiet, and the tension in the room had shifted from crisis to something closer to reckoning. She watched her daughter stand very still, staring at the maintenance note in her hands, doing the math on 8 months of small, deniable decisions that had nearly cost the company its largest deal, and had before that cost one quiet man his standing for no reason beyond someone else's convenience. Margaret watched too, as Emma, brought along that night because Austin's usual sitter had canceled, and there had been no time to arrange another, sat cross-legged on a folded tarp near the hangar's edge, showing Austin, in the 10 minutes of downtime while the paperwork was processed, a drawing she'd made of an airplane with a smiling sun over it, and Austin, still half kneeling by the toolbox, laughing softly for what Margaret suspected was the first time all week, brushing a strand of hair out of Emma's face with the unthinking gentleness of a man who did that gesture 50 times a day, and had simply forgotten anyone might be watching. It was that gesture, more than the fault, more than the note, more than the merger itself, that made Margaret lean toward her daughter and say the 4 words that would end up meaning more than anything else said in that hangar all night. Don't let him leave. Olivia turned, startled, and asked what she meant, and Margaret only nodded toward Austin and Emma, toward the quiet, unhurried tenderness of a father who clearly had no idea he was being evaluated for anything beyond the fault in an aircraft, and said that some men solve what's broken and walk away, and some men solve what's broken and stay to make sure it doesn't break again, and that the difference between those 2 kinds of men was worth more to a company, and to a daughter, than any merger ever would be. Derek Holloway's unraveling had one final beat left in it, one that would not fully surface until the following week, when a routine internal audit, ordered that same night, on Olivia's direct instruction, before she'd even left the hangar, would turn up the original settlement paperwork from Austin's engineering career, the same paperwork Derek had once arranged to be signed under pressure, still sitting quietly in an old case file nobody had thought to connect to a night shift mechanic 3 years later. The audit took 11 days, and by the time it concluded, it had connected every piece Sandra Kim's spreadsheet had only begun to suggest. The discrepancy Austin flagged 8 months earlier, the contractor cost-cutting Derek had quietly authorized, and the settlement paperwork from 3 years before that showed, in Derek's own signature, that he had known about the original unsafe shortcut and had allowed the paper trail to shift responsibility onto the one engineer who'd tried to stop it. Olivia brought the findings to the full board herself rather than delegating it, laying out the timeline without softening any part of it, including the part where her own signature, months earlier, had approved the staffing folder that quietly buried Austin's reassignment. She did not ask the board to spare her any embarrassment. She asked them to terminate Derek Holloway's employment for cause, effective immediately, and to open a formal review of every maintenance decision he had signed off on in the past 5 years, a request that delayed the merger's signing by 2 additional weeks and cost the company, by her own later estimate, several $1 million in penalty clauses. She authorized the delay without hesitation. When one board member asked whether that cost was really necessary, given that the aircraft had, after all, been fixed, Olivia answered that a plane being fixed and a plane being safe were not the same claim, and she wasn't willing to sign her name to the difference. Austin's vindication when it came wasn't loud. Olivia offered it to him plainly, in front of the same engineers and the same hangar crew who'd watched Derek dismiss him 8 months earlier. Full reinstatement of his engineering credentials within the company, a formal correction to his personnel file, and an offer to name him Bennett Aerospace's new Director of Aviation Safety and Maintenance, a role with authority over every contractor and every sign-off across the fleet. He accepted the title, quietly, But when Olivia followed it with an offer of a signing bonus large enough to have made most people in that hangar audibly react, Austin shook his head and said there was something else he wanted instead. Something that would cost the company far less and mean more. A formal whistleblower protection policy, written into the maintenance department's procedures permanently, so that the next person who noticed something wrong wouldn't have to choose between speaking up and protecting their family. Olivia had the policy drafted within the month. It carries Austin's name in its founding memo to this day, not because he asked for the credit, but because Margaret insisted on it over his objection. What came after unfolded slowly, in the unglamorous, ordinary way real things do. Olivia found herself, in the weeks following the merger's eventual signing, inventing small reasons to walk down to the maintenance wing. A question about a fleet report that could easily have been emailed. A scheduling conflict that resolved itself the moment she arrived. Austin noticed, and said nothing about it for a long time, partly out of habit, and partly because some part of him still expected good things to be temporary. It was Emma, in the end, who closed the distance neither adult seemed willing to close themselves, having taken an immediate and unshakable liking to Olivia during the 2 occasions their paths had crossed, and who began asking, with an 8-year-old's total absence of subtlety, whether the airplane lady might come to her school's father-daughter breakfast since her own mother couldn't. Olivia went. She sat through 45 minutes of pancakes and a slideshow about the water cycle, and when Austin thanked her afterward, quietly, in the school parking lot, she told him the truth before she'd fully decided to say it out loud, that she hadn't come for the merger, or the fleet report, or even really for Emma, though she'd meant every minute of that morning. She'd come because some part of her had been looking, without quite admitting it, for a reason to keep finding him. The quiet coda came nearly a year after the night in the hangar, on an unremarkable evening with no cameras and no board members present, when Margaret Bennett sat on the porch of Austin's small house, watching her daughter help Emma with a paper airplane contest for school, folding and refolding the wings until they held a perfect, silent glide across the yard. Margaret didn't say much that evening either, true to form. She simply watched the 3 of them, her daughter, the quiet man, who had once been erased from an industry for doing the right thing, and the little girl now teaching both adults how to fold a better airplane than either of them could manage on their own, and thought, not for the first time, that some kinds of worth take much longer to notice than others, and that the waiting is very often worth it. If there is a person in your own life who reminds you of Austin, someone who was underestimated, quietly pushed aside, or written off before anyone bothered to really understand what they carried, it might be worth taking a moment to think of them by name, and perhaps even to tell them, plainly, what you saw in them all along, the way it so nearly didn't happen for a man who fixed a broken plane in 10 minutes, and had spent 3 years before that fixing everything else quietly, without anyone thinking to say thank you.